Man in a shiny sports car calls a quiet volunteer, just a nobody, at a small farmer's market outside Los Angeles. Little did he know that volunteer was actually Robert Downey Jr. What happened next left everyone speechless. See how this unexpected event turned into a day nobody would forget. But first, I have a quick question. Where are you watching this from? Please let me know in the comments. I love hearing from viewers all around the world. Now, let's get back to our story. Robert Downey Jr. stood beside a simple fruit stand in the middle of a friendly farmer's market. He wore an old t-shirt, faded jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days. He did not look like a famous actor at all. People walked by him, smiled, and thought he was just a local helper. Robert felt happy blending in like this. He was there to help set up for the annual talent show, and he liked the quiet work of placing fruit skewers on a table. The morning sun made the colorful tents shine. Families strolled around, stopping to taste fresh pies or to admire handcrafted items. The air smelled sweet from roasted nuts and cotton candy. Even though the event was small, it felt full of life and excitement. Suddenly, a loud engine noise came from the parking lot. Everyone turned to see a bright red sports car pull up. It looked like a spaceship among the old trucks and family vans. When the door opened, a tall man wearing a fancy suit and expensive sunglasses stepped out. His shoes were shiny, and his hair was styled perfectly. He gazed at the market. With a look of surprise and maybe even a little disgust, Robert saw people whispering and pointing at the flashy car. The man walked around slowly, scanning the rows of stalls. Then he spotted Robert, who was busy arranging more fruit. The man marched up with a firm step and spoke in a cold voice. "Is this where I sign up for the talent show?" he asked, sounding bored. Robert smiled politely. "Yes, sir," he said, pointing to a small table near the entrance. A piece of paper taped to the front read, "Talent Show Sign-Ups." The man gave a quick nod and walked away without another word. A few people nearby watched him with raised eyebrows. Some whispered, wondering who he was. Others shrugged and went back to their shopping. Robert stayed calm and kept working. He did not mind that the man had a rude attitude. All Robert cared about was making sure the fruit skewers looked nice for the guests. A few minutes later, the man returned. He looked Robert up and down, eyeing his plain clothes and dusty sneakers. "You work here?" he asked in a sharp tone. Robert nodded. "I'm just helping out. We need to get everything ready before the show starts." The man smirked. So you're not entering the talent show? I guess you're not the kind of person who stands out." Robert's eyes stayed gentle, and he gave a small shrug. "I'm happy doing what I'm doing." The fancy man laughed in a short, mean way. "Well, good luck with that," he said. Then he turned on his heel and walked toward another row of tables, leaving a strange hush behind him. An older woman, Mrs. Green, stood nearby. She was wearing a big sun hat and holding a basket of apples. She looked at Robert and frowned. "That man's got some nerve," she muttered under her breath. Robert's friendly smile returned, and he gently rearranged a strawberry on top of a fruit skewer. "It's all right," he said softly. "Maybe he's just having a bad day." Mrs. Green blinked at him, surprised by his calm response. She patted his arm and wandered off, shaking her head. Meanwhile, the sun kept climbing higher, and more people arrived at the market. Kids laughed as they ran between tables, while parents tried to keep them close. Everyone seemed excited for the talent show that would start in the afternoon. Musicians tuned their guitars. A young girl practiced her dance steps in a corner, and a local baker offered free samples of her famous bread. Yet, even in this warm and friendly place, something felt tense. The rude stranger's comments had made a small ripple of worry among the vendors and visitors. No one knew that the humble volunteer in old sneakers was actually Robert Downey Jr., and no one guessed that by the end of the day, a big surprise would leave them all in awe. Robert Downey Jr. kept arranging fruit skewers on the table while people walked by, chatting and laughing. The farmer's market had a cozy feeling. Bright ribbons and colorful signs hung from the tents. the sweet smell of baked goods mixed with the earthy scent of fresh vegetables. A small stage stood at one end, ready for the afternoon's talent show. A microphone waited at the center and a few folding chairs were set up nearby. The fancy man who drove the shiny sports car was named John Blake. He wore a crisp suit that seemed too perfect for this relaxed gathering. He stood near a group of local musicians who were talking about their upcoming performance. John frowned when one of the guitar players accidentally bumped his shoulder. "Watch it," John snapped, stepping back like he might catch something from their casual clothes. His eyes moved around the stage as if he was trying to find a spot that matched his high standards. The musicians whispered to each other, clearly bothered by his rude tone. Meanwhile, Robert stayed busy helping. The local vendors, an older woman named Mrs. Green, needed help lifting a heavy box of homemade jam jars. Robert quickly offered a hand. He smiled gently as they carried the box to her table. Mrs. Green thanked him and gave him a small jar as a gift. He tried to refuse one, but she insisted, saying, "You've been too kind to us, young man." As Robert set the jar down, he noticed John watching them from across the way. John's expression was a mix of confusion and something else, maybe irritation. Robert did not confront him. Instead, he nodded politely and walked back to the fruit stand to check on his supplies. Soon, the farmer's market grew busier. A group of teenagers practicing a dance routine came to sign up for the talent show. They giggled and waved at Robert, who waved back. He enjoyed the happy mood of the day, and he seemed to glow from the simple fun of it all. John, however, kept making comments that showed he didn't share this joy. He complained that the music was too loud or that the tables were too close together. At one point, he even muttered that the whole event looked cheap. Some people overheard him. They glanced at Robert with questioning eyes as if to say, "Is he for real?" Robert just shrugged and offered a calm smile. He did not want to argue or cause a scene. He understood that John was likely not used to small-town events. Maybe John thought he was above everyone else, or maybe he was just having a rough day. Robert believed that kindness could sometimes melt even the hardest hearts. The difference between the two men became clearer as they went about the market. Robert moved slowly, listening to people's stories and admiring their crafts. He helped tie a loose banner back into place so it wouldn't fall. He stopped to pet a friendly dog that a visitor had brought along. Everyone who spoke to Robert walked away smiling, feeling a bit lighter. On the other hand, John strode through the crowd with a stiff posture. He seemed eager to tell people about himself, but showed little interest in learning about them. Whenever someone tried to talk about the local produce or homemade crafts, John quickly turned the topic to his own goals. He boasted about his business deals and high-end lifestyle, dropping hints that he was used to fancy restaurants and high-class events. During one such conversation, he mentioned the talent show. "I plan to give the best performance today," he said to a local artist who was preparing a display of paintings. "No one here can top what I'm going to do." His voice dripped with confidence. The artist looked uncomfortable but forced a polite smile. A bit later, John stopped near Robert again. This time, Robert was helping a child pick out a fruit skewer. The little girl smiled up at Robert like he was a hero. As she trotted off with her colorful snack, John narrowed his eyes. "I see you're busy," he said in a low voice. "You seem pretty proud of yourself for someone who's just a helper." Robert shook his head gently. "I'm just happy to be here, doing what I can." "Don't you want to do something bigger?" John asked, his tone almost mocking. "Something people will remember?" Robert paused for a moment. He glanced around at the happy families, the warm sunshine, and the friendly atmosphere. Then he said softly, "Sometimes, the little things are the big things." John snorted. "We'll see how you feel after you watch a real star on stage," he said, turning away. "I'm going to blow everyone's mind at the talent show." Robert simply nodded, watching as John headed toward the stage area. A few curious bystanders caught the tense exchange. They looked at Robert with worry, unsure if this was going to lead to a bigger clash. Robert just smiled at them, as if to say there was nothing to fear. Yet, a quiet feeling spread among the crowd. People noticed how different these two men were. One was kind and patient, the other was proud and dismissive. And with the talent show about to start soon, no one could guess how this growing conflict might end. As the sun rose higher, more people arrived at the farmers' market. For the talent show, vendors hurried to finish setting up before the event began. Children raced around, chasing each other between the tables. The stage at the far end of the market looked simple, just a few wooden boards and a microphone stand. But folks seemed excited for whatever performances would happen there. John Blake, wearing his fancy suit, stood by the stage entrance. He kept checking his watch and tapping his shiny shoes on the ground, looking annoyed whenever someone asked him to move so they could set up speakers or music stands. One of the organizers, a friendly woman named Mrs. Taylor, tried to guide him to a waiting area, but John waved her off. "I can stand wherever I like," he snapped. "I'm here to steal the show, not hide in some corner." Meanwhile, Robert Downey Jr. was still helping with little tasks around the market. He passed out extra chairs for older visitors who needed a place to sit. He refilled pitchers of lemonade and brought them to the refreshment table. Even though he was a big movie star in secret, he seemed more comfortable doing these small chores than being in the spotlight. Some of the local performers started to rehearse. A group of teen dancers practiced a short routine. Country singer tested the microphone, humming a tune. Nearby, a magician shuffled cards and tested his tricks on a small crowd. All of this made the air buzz with energy and anticipation. John watched the rehearsals with a smug grin. "Amateurs," he muttered, loud enough for people to hear. A few of the dancers looked hurt by his words, but they tried to ignore him and stay focused. Robert noticed the tension. He walked over to the dancers and asked if they needed anything. One of the girls admitted they were nervous. She glanced over at John, who was staring in their direction. "He keeps making comments," she said softly, "and it's kind of scary." Robert placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Just do your best," he said with a warm smile. "You're here to have fun, right?" She nodded, smiling back. Then she went to join her friends, and they started their routine again, trying to tune out John's disapproving looks. As more and more people gathered around the stage, John decided to turn his attention back to Robert. He walked up and cleared his throat. "So," he began, looking at the fruit skewers that Robert was still arranging. "No talent show entry for you?" Robert shook his head. "No, I'd rather help behind the scenes. This place needs volunteers." John smirked. "You're wasting your time. If you think people will remember some nice guy handing out fruit, you're wrong. They remember real performers, not helpers." Robert stayed calm. "Kindness often leaves a lasting impression," he said gently. John rolled his eyes. "We'll see about that. When I get on that stage and show off my skills, people will be talking about me for months, or maybe even years." A few passers-by stopped to listen. Some frowned at John's rude remarks. Others looked curious, wondering how Robert would respond. But Robert just offered a soft smile. He looked around at the cheerful faces of the families and friends who had come for a nice day. Just then, the event organizer, Mrs. Taylor, grabbed a microphone. "Hello, everyone," she called out. "We'll be starting the talent show in just 30 minutes. Performers, please make sure you're ready. We can't wait to see what you've prepared." A round of applause followed her announcement. Children's laughter and excited chatter filled the air. John flashed a bright, confident grin. He patted the front pocket of his suit as if he had something special in there, then strutted toward the stage. Robert finished placing the last of the fruit skewers. He handed a few to some kids who were looking at the colorful treats. One little boy took a bite and said, "Wow, these are so good." Robert smiled and ruffled the boy's hair. A small group of farmers stood talking near the fruit stand. One of them, Mr. Hill, gave Robert a concerned look. "I heard that fancy fellow talking down to you. Doesn't that bother you?" Robert shrugged. "I'm all right. He seems stressed." Mr. Hill shook his head. "He sure is. He kept bragging about his big performance. Sounds like he thinks he's better than everyone else. Robert paused for a moment. He thought about how people sometimes use pride to hide their fears or worries. Still, John's mean attitude was beginning to cause trouble. Robert looked across the market and saw John laughing loudly, probably making fun of something else. Even the children felt the tension. A little girl asked her mom, "Why is that man so angry?" Her mom whispered something reassuring, but she glanced at Robert with a worried expression. Robert decided not to let John's behavior ruin the day. He went back to helping people, guiding them to their seats and clearing trash to keep the area clean. Some folks thanked him with friendly pats on the back. Others asked his name, but he just smiled and said he was happy to help. By now, almost everyone was ready for the show to begin. But the stage was not just a place for music and dancing anymore. It had become the focus of the growing tension between John and the rest of the market. Nobody knew how the afternoon would turn out, but many guessed that John Blake's performance and Robert's calm presence would collide in a way that would leave everyone talking long after the day was over. The talent show stage was finally set. A row of chairs in front was filled with eager families, friends, and market visitors. Mrs. Taylor tapped the microphone to test the sound, then smiled brightly at the crowd. "Welcome, everyone. Thank you for coming to our annual talent show. We have a wonderful list of performers today, so let's get started." The first act was a local band. They played a happy tune that made people clap and nod their head. Next came the group of teenage dancers. They twirled and jumped in time with the music. Even though John had made rude comments earlier, the crowd gave the dancers loud cheers. They left the stage beaming with pride. Robert Downey Jr. stood off to the side, quietly watching. He didn't plan to perform, but he loved seeing people share their talents. The joy on their faces reminded him why he enjoyed acting so much. He was glad to see the dancers push past John's mean remarks. After a few more acts, Mrs. Taylor stepped forward. "Up next," she said, "we have John Blake." She read from the sign-up sheet, her tone still polite, but she looked a bit uncertain. People in the crowd glanced around. Some had noticed John's attitude and didn't seem too excited to see him perform. Still, applause filled the air because everyone wanted to give each performer a fair chance. John strode onto the stage. In his spotless suit, looking very confident, he announced that he would sing a famous pop song. The backing track began to play from the speakers, and John started his performance. His voice wasn't bad, but it wasn't great either. Yet he acted like he was the world's biggest star, pointing at the crowd and strutting around the small stage. Some people clapped politely, but a few children giggled at his over-the-top posing. Halfway through the song, John noticed that the crowd's reaction was mild. He tried even harder to impress them, jumping around and raising his hands as if he was performing in a huge arena. One of the speakers made a funny crackling noise, and John shot a glare at the sound guy, as if it was his fault. The song ended with a long note that John stretched out a bit too far. When the music finally stopped, the audience gave him a polite round of applause, nothing more. John, looking frustrated, marched off the stage. He mumbled something under his breath, probably angry that people weren't cheering like crazy. As he stepped down, he almost bumped into Robert, who was carrying a stack of cups to the refreshment table. "Watch out!" John hissed, glaring at Robert as if he had ruined the performance. Robert set the cups down and turned back to John. He offered a gentle smile. "That was a brave effort," Robert said, trying to be kind. John frowned. "I'm used to a higher level of praise," he said with a huff. "This crowd doesn't know real talent when they see it." Right then, a teenager tugged on Robert's sleeve. "Excuse me," she said shyly, holding up a small notebook. "Could you sign this for me?" John looked confused. "Why would you want his autograph?" he asked, pointing to Robert's plain clothes and hat. The girl blushed. "Because he's Robert Downey Jr.," she said quietly. A hush fell over the area. People nearby turned their heads, and a few gasped. Others whispered, "Wait, the Robert Downey Jr., the actor." Some pulled out their phones, snapping pictures or recording video. John stood there, his mouth hanging open in shock. Mrs. Taylor, who had come over to see what was happening, nearly dropped her clipboard. "Oh my goodness," she breathed, looking like she was about to faint. You're him." At first, Robert looked embarrassed. He had hoped to keep his identity a secret, just to enjoy a normal day, but he could see there was no point in hiding anymore. With a kind smile, he said, "Yes, it's me. I'm really just here to help and have a good time, like everyone else." People started to buzz with excitement. A local news blogger, who was there to cover the talent show, quickly turned on her camera and rushed toward Robert. A few other performers gathered around, eyes wide with awe. Meanwhile, John just stared. His fancy suit and proud manner seemed to shrink before everyone's eyes. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. After a long moment, he finally muttered, That can't be true." Robert gently took the teenager's notebook and scribbled his name. He handed it back to her with a friendly smile. "Thanks for being a fan," he said softly. Then he turned to John and gave a small shrug, as if to say, "I'm sorry if this surprises you." John's cheeks flushed red. He stood there, looking lost and small. All this time, he had acted like the biggest star in the room. Yet the real star had been quietly passing out fruit skewers and helping people all along. By now, a crowd had formed around Robert. People thanked him for visiting their little market. Some asked for pictures or autographs. Mrs. Green, holding her basket of jam, just kept saying, "I had no idea. You're so down to earth, dear." John stepped back, the shine of his suit no longer impressing anyone. He glanced at the crowd surrounding Robert, then folded his arms. "Gio." He couldn't hide his embarrassment, but he also looked confused, as if he was trying to figure out how a mega-famous actor could be so humble. The excitement grew louder, and more folks rushed over, wanting to meet the superstar. Yet, Robert remained calm, answering questions politely and treating everyone with warmth. The entire energy of the farmers' market had suddenly changed, all because of this simple truth. The kind helper had been a world-famous actor all along. Excited chatter spread through the farmers' market as people realized the friendly man helping at the fruit stand was none other than Robert Downey Jr. Everyone wanted a chance to shake his hand or snap a quick photo. The local news blogger asked Robert if she could record a short interview. He agreed, but only if they kept it quick. He still had work to do for the market, after all. Meanwhile, John Blake stood off to one side, watching the scene with troubled face. For a moment, he seemed too stunned to move. He had come here expecting to be the center of attention. He believed he was the most important person in the room. Now, people rushed right past him to meet someone he had treated like a lowly helper. Robert, seeing John standing alone, slowly moved through the crowd toward him. He paused to sign an autograph for a young boy, then continued. When he reached John, he offered a gentle smile. John tried to glare, but he couldn't hold it for long. His cheeks were still flushed from embarrassment. "Listen," Robert began in a calm tone. "I didn't mean to surprise everyone. I just wanted to have a normal day." John swallowed hard. I didn't know," he said, sounding unsure. You should have told me who you were." Robert shook his head softly. "I wanted to help behind the scenes, not be the star here. It's nice to do something simple sometimes." John opened his mouth to protest, but then shut it. He glanced around at the crowd, still buzzing with excitement. Some folks were whispering about him, wondering if he felt silly now. John looked uncomfortable, as if he knew people were judging him for his earlier behavior. Robert's face showed kindness. "I'm sorry if today has been rough for you," he said. "I know it can be strange when things don't go the way we plan." John let out a long sigh. For once, he didn't have a snappy reply. His shoulders drooped, and his proud stance softened. I thought I was so special," he admitted in a low voice. "I came here expecting people to cheer for me. Instead, I got a lukewarm clap and then found out I was rude to someone far more important. Robert placed a hand on John's shoulder. Everyone here is important, he said gently. You never know who you might be talking to. John nodded, but his eyes were still downcast. He noticed how Robert didn't even mention being a big movie star. He spoke only of the people around them, showing that every person mattered. John thought about the rude comments he had made, the times he brushed people aside or looked down on their simple ways. Up on the stage, Mrs. Taylor announced the next performer, and the crowd cheered. Music played, and laughter rose from the audience. Even though the talent show continued, many folks kept glancing over at Robert and John, curious to see if there would be a confrontation. But Robert's calm voice and kind words seemed to keep things peaceful. John fiddled with the cufflinks on his suit jacket. I guess I have a lot to learn, he mumbled. I'm sorry for how I acted. Robert gave a slow nod. Apologies are a good start, but don't forget, people remember how you make them feel. Maybe you can use your talents in a way that lifts others up instead of pushing them aside. John's gaze traveled across the market. He saw vendors happily chatting with customers, kids dancing around, and families enjoying the show together. He realized this community spirit was what truly made the event special. It wasn't about having the fanciest clothes or the loudest voice on stage. It was about people coming together with kindness and respect. Do you think it's too late to fix things? He asked softly. Robert looked around at the warm smiles and friendly faces. It's never too late if you're honest and try hard, he said, but don't expect it to happen all at once. John nodded, looking thoughtful. He glanced over at the teen dancers he had insulted. They were huddled in a corner, still talking about their performance. For a second, John hesitated, as if wondering whether he should walk over and apologize. Robert watched him with a supportive smile. Then the blogger who wanted to interview Robert approached. She asked John, "Would you mind stepping aside so I can talk with Robert?" Her words were polite, but it was clear she did not think much of John after his earlier behavior. John stepped back without complaining. He stayed close, though, seeming to think about Robert's words. He noticed how Robert treated the blogger with respect and answered her questions kindly. People were drawn to Robert, not just because he was famous, but because he seemed to care about them. The music on stage ended, and there was more. Applause. John realized he had a choice. He could slip away and leave the market, or he could try to fix his mistakes. He thought about Robert's advice. You can use your talents to help others. Something inside John shifted. He took a deep breath, then walked over to where Mrs. Taylor was standing by the stage. She looked surprised to see him, but she didn't turn him away. They started talking in low voices, and John seemed sincere. Whatever he was saying, Mrs. Taylor nodded slowly and then gave him a small, understanding smile. Nearby, Robert was finishing his interview. A group of curious onlookers had gathered around, still buzzing with excitement. But some of them also watched John and wondered what he was up to. They noticed that John wasn't shouting or boasting anymore. His head was bowed, and his posture had changed. Some tension still hung in the air, but there was also hope. People could sense that a lesson was being learned, one that might lead to better understanding. The farmers' market carried on with its cozy atmosphere, and more performances filled the afternoon with music, dancing, and laughter. Yet everyone kept an eye on John Blake, waiting to see what he would do next. Mrs. Taylor walked on stage with a gentle smile, holding the microphone. The crowd hushed, eager to see what was coming next. Off to the side, Robert Downey Jr. stood quietly, surrounded by a few fans who still wanted pictures. John Blake stood near the backstage area, looking thoughtful instead of annoyed. The mood in the market was now calm but charged with a new kind of excitement. Everyone, Mrs. Taylor began, thank you for making this year's talent show so special. We have seen singers, dancers, musicians, and more. They filled our day with fun and creativity. She glanced toward John and waved him forward. He stepped onto the stage, holding a small piece of paper. His suit still looked fancy, but he no longer acted like he was above everyone else. He cleared his throat into the microphone. Hi, he said softly. My name is John Blake. I've realized today that I've made some mistakes. A few people shifted in their seats. Curious, John continued. I came here wanting attention and respect. I even said some mean things. But I learned something important from watching all of you and from meeting Mr. Robert Downey Jr. He paused, looking at the paper in his hand. I don't have the right words to make everything better, but I'd like to try. John gestured to the teenage dancers who had performed earlier. You all were amazing. I'm sorry I made you feel bad. You deserve the applause you got. He nodded at the local band and the other acts. All of you have talent, and I was wrong to put you down. This place, this farmer's market, it's special because people here support each other. I want to support you, too. A gentle applause began to spread through the crowd. Some folks smiled at John, seeing a change in his attitude. Mrs. Taylor nodded and gave him a small pat on the shoulder. John stepped down, and Robert took a moment to walk up. He didn't go onto the stage. Instead, he stood in front of it, facing the crowd. I think we've all learned a good lesson today, he said in a calm, friendly tone. We never know someone else's story. A quiet helper could be a famous actor. A person who seems proud might actually be unsure inside. He glanced. John, who met his eyes. There seemed to be a silent understanding between them now, something like respect. Robert went on. What matters most is how we treat people. A little kindness can change someone's whole day. The crowd clapped and cheered. Robert lifted his hand to thank them, then stepped aside. The farmer's market began to move again, as people continued with shopping, chatting, and packing up. Some families had to go home, and a few performers cleaned their instruments or costumes. But the air felt lighter, as if a fresh breeze had swept away the tension. Later, John approached the teen dancers. He handed them a bundle of fresh flowers he bought from a vendor. I'm sorry for what I said earlier, he told them. They smiled in surprise and accepted the flowers. One girl even gave John a quick hug, which made him blush and smile. Robert, meanwhile, helped. The market staff take down chairs and fold up tables. Some people still came by, asking for selfies. He agreed happily but kept working between photos. Even though everyone now knew his true identity, he acted just the same, humble and caring. As the sun began to set, Mrs. Taylor thanked Robert for choosing their small market to visit. We'll never forget this day, she told him. You reminded us that true stars don't always need the spotlight to shine. He laughed gently at that and said, Thank you for letting me be part of this. I had a wonderful time. Nearby, John quietly picked up some trash left behind near the stage. He seemed different now, less hurried, more thoughtful. He caught Robert's eye and gave a small nod. Robert nodded back, like a promise of a new beginning. If there's one thing we can learn from this story, it's that the way we treat people matters more than anything else. We never know who we're talking to or what they're going through. A simple act of kindness can lead to big changes in someone's heart, even our own. Take a moment to think about how you treat the people around you. Are you quick to judge? Or do you stop to offer a helping hand? Do you look down on others? Or do you try to lift them up? Let's all try to be more like Robert Downey Jr. was at the market, humble, kind, and ready to help. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please share it with someone who needs a little inspiration. Remember, sometimes the smallest good deed can have the biggest impact. Keep spreading kindness, and stay tuned for more uplifting stories coming soon.